the Journalism Fund today has agreed to slightly change the format that they normally do. And we are freestyling a little bit more in this. And we wanted to give you as live a discussion between us as possible. So it's pre-prepared, but there's a slightly different format in that we don't have blocks of 15-minute speakers. And I think you can come out of this slide if you want. So we'll be switching back and forth between let me start then in this one. This is, so the Dart Center, I still have the box. Let me see if I can get rid of it. Yes, I can. So the host for you for this is, on this occasion, the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma. As you can tell by the name, looking at issues of trauma and psychology related to journalism is what we do. We're a project of Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism in New York City, with satellite offices in London, where I am, and in Melbourne, covering Asia Pacific. We are a resource center and global network of journalists, journalism educators, and health professionals. And what we do, our remit is to improve media coverage of trauma, conflict, and tragedy. And that is certainly something where we now think the climate crisis is hugely relevant. And so we work with journalists, media organizations to better deal with these issues, and also with health professionals. You can see we have lots on the sidebar of these slides. You can see we've got lots of slides about interviewing, tips of interviewing vulnerable contributors that may be relevant. We're not going to go into that for this conversation, but it may be relevant if you cover the climate crisis, if you're in places where people have been physically affected. So there are tips for interviewing vulnerable contributors, lots of topics on the sidebar. And then if you want to go into the next slide, we also run various fellowships. This one is the Ockberg Fellowship, for which the applications are now open. So you may want to consider that. And at this point, let me throw to Paula, who is the Journalism Fund co-host for today. And she's also got some news on the fellowship front.
Thank you, Juliana. Welcome everyone to this session that has been co-organized with the Dart Center. We are very happy to collaborate in this kind of sessions. And of course, this is the first one. We are waiting for the second one next Friday. And we also would like to share with you some opportunities that we offer to investigative journalists. We have the Earth Investigations program that is composed by 2 grant programs. The first one that is called the Investigation Grants for Environmental Journalism. And this grant program supports cross-border teams of professional journalists and news outlets as well to conduct investigations into environmental affairs related to continental Europe. The next deadline for this grant program is on the 27th of April. So if you have questions regarding the application, you can contact us to have an individual meeting with us to help you go through the application process. We also have another grant program that is called the Professional Development Grants for Environmental Journalism. This program is open for organizations with project proposals for collective development and support services to build the capacities of environmental investigative journalists. The deadline for this grant program is on the 25th of May. And if you are interested to apply, if you have an organization that is working on this kind of issues, you can also write us to organize a pre-application meeting with us. We are open to help you with all the details. And of course, we are also open to collaborate with you if you would like to collaborate in this kind of sessions that we are doing today. We are waiting for your message, and please knock our door when you need any of our assistance. And yes, thank you again, Juliana, for organizing and for co-organizing this webinar. And we hope that a lot of people could benefit from this session today. Thank you.
Right. And Daniel, if you want to come out of the slide, that's fine. And Paula, if you haven't done that, why don't you post a link to your fellowships into the chat? And I should also say that you can put questions into the chat, of course. There will be a Q&A at the end. And my colleague Minal who has just gone invisible. She will put a Google Doc link into the chat. If you are interested in staying in touch with us on this, we're going to organize some more events as the Dart Center around it. You can put your email into the Google Doc. It'll stay live for about an hour. And then we have your contact if that is something that interests you more. So as you all know, because you've signed up for this, let me say that this is the first out of 2 webinars. And, you know, this is about climate trauma and, well, not just trauma, climate anxiety. And we're going to deep dive into the terminology because lots of different terms flying around. And then the webinar next Friday is about storytelling. And also we will look at this at from a more psychological point of view and how our audiences, news consumers affected by the stories. And we have 3 experts who will speak about it and a journalist who will comment on that. And now, enough from me. Let me introduce the 3 panelists that we have for today. The first one is Sarah Schurman, who's waving at you. And really, we have 3 amazing panelists. Sarah is the co-founder of Climate Journalism Network in Germany, which is a space for journalists to exchange information and discuss best practice in the reporting of the climate crisis. She's also the author of the book Klartext Klima, a German book, which is about the understanding of the climate crisis. And she works as a consultant for climate reporting in newsrooms. And wants to put climate into every story, which we will talk a little bit more about in a minute. Then we have Megan, who is standing in for Patrick, who's part of a team of climate psychologists who work with schools, local community and media organizations based here in the UK, based in Oxford. She has an MA in psychology from Oxford University and is a professional coach specialized in climate. So she will help us understand some of the language of psychology around this subject. And she's also the co-author of a recent book, Turning the Tide on Climate Anxiety, and an upcoming book for young people. And then last but not least, the man with the job that probably every journalism student would like to have is Ajit Narajan, who is a journalist specialized in climate reporting, and for Deutsche Welle television, global broadcaster and beyond. He is the host of the enormously successful Planet 8A, which is a series of video explainers dealing with the climate crisis and beyond. And yeah, like I said, it's hugely successful. It has over 400,000 subscribers and more than 500 million viewers. So in terms of a practicing journalist, Ajit brings an enormous amount of experience to this conversation. Last but not least, he also reminded us to say this is a European, conversation organized by the Dart Center Europe and with Journalismfund Europe. And we just want to acknowledge that lots of people in the global south and other parts of the world are much more seriously affected by the scale of the crisis than we are. And that we're probably not diving too much into that today, but we feel that it's worth acknowledging. Daniel, do you want to pin Sarah as in speaker's view? Because the way I met you, first met you, says a lot about who you are, and you're smiling because you know what's coming. We were both at a investigative journalism conference in Hamburg, and I first saw Sarah on a panel in a relatively small room on the climate track, where she was talking about how newsrooms should incorporate climate into every story, because climate literacy is now as important as financial literacy. And then Sarah spoke about the fact that really, and plenty of people in the audience agreed that climate conversation shouldn't be on a climate track on an alternative stage. And then the next day, there was a very big, important sort of big name discussion on the main stage, and Marion Ulmer, who's one of our panelists in the next webinar, was on the panel. And basically in an act of civil disobedience, Marion invited Sarah to crash the panel and to bring the climate perspective to it. And that was really powerful. And it was also very powerful to witness what happens when people who didn't expect somebody to bring the climate perspective to a normal panel, what happens, to the conversation and to the body language. So, Sarah, can you tell me a little bit more about what you do, how you work, and how you train newsrooms in climate reporting?
Yeah, this panel that you were talking about was about responsibility of media reporting, and it was with a lot of editors-in-chief. It wasn't really about climate. Maren tried to make it about climate, but to be sure that we're really talking about like the responsibility we're having there. I just like walked in and was really friendly for the rest of the time, I would say, but just like also trying to use emotions, something that we are talking about today, to make people realize, well, we're not doing enough, and maybe this is all kind of worse than many editors-in-chief think. And also what we're also maybe talking about today is that it's still kind of like, okay, you're having trouble covering climate, so you're kind of having a problem, but it's more like, no, this is an adequate reaction to really working on climate the whole day and not being able to just like repress all these emotions. And that's also how it kind of started for me. I'm a journalist for about 12 years now, and for the first 10 years I wasn't working on climate at all. It was more like I was interested in it kind of in a private way for 2 years from 2018 on. And I was reading about it like every day, but I didn't really realize that it really affects my life. I was like, okay, my grandchildren, and before it really gets worse, we're gonna stop it and save it, because why shouldn't we? And then one day in summer 2020, I just realized, oh, no, it's not about my grandchildren, it's about me and my generation and even my parents' generation. And we don't really try to stop all this on a level that we can cope with. And since then, I'm like really just working 100% on the connection and interconnection of the climate crisis and how it's represented in the media and the newsrooms. And I'm offering trainings by now for newsrooms or journalists to have the foundation to report on, but also like how to report on it in a constructive way, and also how to kind of work with it, cope with it as a journalist. And that's what I do now.
Thanks, Sarah. Megan, let me go to you. You're a psychologist specialized in climate. What do you bring to this? And can you tell us a little bit more about the trainings that you do with media organizations in the UK? You've trained with The Guardian, with Sky TV and others. Why are these trainings important? And what do you do as a climate psychologist?
So as a climate psychologist, we came just as a bit of background, had a traditional practice in Oxford, England, and we started to have clients presenting with what we now identify as eco or climate anxiety. And these were people that were consuming lots of information about the climate every day, really, in sort of on the front line of it to one degree or another. And they were experiencing high levels of burnout. They were experiencing high levels of frustration, anger, because they were trying to communicate on what we call the information deficit model, of which I think a lot of journalists work on. You have the information, you relate it to the public and what needs to happen. And then there's just sort of this gap in the middle where nothing happens or it doesn't get through. And that's really frustrating for a lot of people that are working day to day in this kind of field. And so we started to develop different tools and resources, because different to another phobia, for example, this isn't something that we want to help people get over. We want to help people engage with it and feel more resilient and feel stronger through it. But actually, we all need to be experiencing these climate emotions because they help connect us to our causes and our values, and identifying what needs to change within our systems. And so we work with media, and we work with schools, and we work with private companies and organizations in order to integrate this sort of as in a way that's as supportive as possible, that bridges that gap between knowing and the action, but actually the doing part. So that's when the behavioral psychology sort of comes into play as well.
we're coming to Ajit, who is a specialized climate reporter. And yes, how did you get to specializing in climate? And can you tell us a little bit more about Planet A, the video explainers and the films that you're making for Deutsche Welle, and yeah, what you're trying to achieve, like what you hope for your work. That's really what I'm asking, the impact you hope.
Yeah, so I'm a climate reporter. I've been covering this for the last, three and a bit years. And one of the things that, I think I always had very much this attitude that, okay, climate change is there and I'm vegetarian and I don't really need to engage too much with the topic. I wasn't somebody who would click on the Guardian article headlines that I was seeing, and I wasn't paying much attention to it. My background's in civil engineering, so I kind of had a broad awareness of kind of the science side of things, but didn't really engage with it on any kind of personal level. And I think that's quite a common thing that a lot of people in our social circles probably have, and maybe some of us to a certain extent too. When I joined DW's environment team in 2019, I kind of, threw myself into the topic, mainly out of a kind of mild sense of imposter phenomenon, which I guess maybe a lot of people here have also can relate to, but a feeling of wanting to understand it in enough depth that I could really be able to confidently write about it and talk about it. And the problem with doing that, and I know it's something that Zara and I have also talked about, is that you end up spending hours kind of, I don't know, on the metro on the way home from the pub, reading Twitter threads about the ins and outs of methane emissions and underestimates and how much it's actually heating the planet and what happens if those end up spiraling out of control, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And the common theme there is, I guess, seeing scientists who are way more blunt about how bad things actually are. And sorry, just to link all of that to kind of the journalism side of things, what we're doing with Planet A, which also, sorry, I think, Juliana, in your really nice introduction, you maybe said it was 500 million views. I think there's an extra zero. That was an extra zero more than it actually is. It's 50 million views. I think we're just getting to. But yeah,
Thank you for correcting.
No worries. I just thought
Not bad.
Yeah, that would be ideal. One thing that's been nice about this has been that we basically saw that there was a massive niche in the market. Now, YouTube is like the second most visited website in the world, and we basically have no competition. PBS in the US had a show called Hot Mess, which they've now discontinued, and a couple of individual climate YouTubers, influencers have got their own followings, but basically no media outlet is really doing anything serious on the platform, or has not successfully done anything serious on the platform about climate change specifically. And one thing we did from the very beginning was we wanted to take a solutions-focused approach to it, partly from this idea that's quite present in a lot of newsrooms of, okay, people don't want to hear any more about bad news. They don't want to hear bad stuff about climate change, they want good news. And I think as the reporters who kind of developed the channel, we had, a lot of conversations about this and what the right way to draw that line is. Does it even make a difference? And so, our conclusion was, let's do critical solutions, let's evaluate solutions. And yeah, sorry, I feel like I'm rambling a little bit here, but to sum that up, the aim of the channel is to reach people who would not otherwise normally be consuming information about climate change, and to do so in a way that is more engaging. And that's basically the benefit we found. Talking about solutions might not be great for people's mental health, it might not actually make much difference, but it is certainly more engaging, and it's a new angle on a story that everyone should care about more than they currently do. Yeah, with that on.
Thanks. And I think the next round of questions really gets us into the thick of it, because we know from a lot of reporters and journalists who cover the climate beat that they do have emotional reactions. I want to put this as neutral as possible at this point before we get into definitions to covering the story. And I'm going to start with Sarah again, because I think it's for you, it's really been quite a roller coaster. And what I've done is I've asked both Sarah and Ajit to send in a couple of stories that illustrate and that sort of on the journey, on the emotional journey through covering the climate that have had an impact. So Daniel, do you want to put up a slide with Sarah's story? And then Sarah, do you the slides that you've sent me, the first two are the stories, and then the second slide is, you know, what helped you through it. So let's start with the first one. Do you want to talk us through why these stories had an impact on you and actually what your reaction was? Because I'm going to take it slightly, but you did hit rock bottom at one stage, didn't you?
Yeah, for me it was really quite hard, and I was really hit very strongly and very like fast. So like I'm talking a lot to psychologists, like on a professional level, on how to cover things well and like why we are all repressing things and not really being conscious about it. And everybody was like, okay, you were kind of quick with your realization and your crisis and stuff. And I mentioned two stories. The first one is pretty well known, I guess. It's from Jonathan Franzen, the author, and he wrote an essay, What If We Stop Pretending? And it was really interesting because when it came out, I read it and it hit me really hard. And I was really like, I don't know, crying for hours and being really devastated about it. And then the German climate community, the activists and also scientists picked up on it and were like, no, this is totally doomism and it's not right and it's not as bad as he writes and stuff like this. And this kind of funnily made me go back into happy land for another 10 months and being like, oh, okay, when it's not right, then okay, it won't be that bad. And happy land is a term that Tupoka Ogette came up with for the fact that many people don't really want to realize that they also have structural racism inside them, and it's more like no racists, it's always the others. And I think, but happy land is also a very good term to describe when you're being able to suppress your realization and emotions about the climate crisis, I think. And then I was following Peter Kalmus, the author of the other article you can see from The Guardian there. And he's a NASA scientist who's really communicating very emotionally and very clearly about the climate crisis. And I was following him on Twitter for several months, I guess. And for half of the time, I thought when I read his tweets, I was like, yeah, I know the climate crisis, it's really bad. It's really a big thing. And for the other half of his tweets, I was more like, okay, he's like an American and I think he's more emotional than me and I can't really relate to what he says. And then one day, he and a colleague of his, or a meteorologist from the US, Eric Holthaus, were writing that they are really like shocked every fucking day about where we're at in the climate crisis and how we're reacting on it as a society. And I was like, okay, I can't really say that about me. I'm really reading about the climate crisis every day, and I really changed my life. I'm not flying anymore, and I'm really worried. But I can't say that I'm that much shocked. And then this kind of opened something inside me because I was like, okay, he's a NASA scientist. Probably he knows more about the climate crisis than me. So what did I miss? And this was really an opportunity for me to kind of the next time let information that I got sink in a little deeper, I would say, and to realize that, okay, maybe things are different than I already thought, because this is also really interesting in psychology that we tend to interpret new information in the way we already see the world, even though the information are capable to really crush the way we see the world. And so I would say that, yeah, emotion are really, really important, but we will get later to it. I'm also meanwhile convinced that not everybody has to really hit rock bottom, as you say, and that not everybody has to go as deep into it emotionally than I was doing for the last years.
And you also, and I say that because you've spoken about that before publicly, you also sought help, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that like there is a point where you get like worried and anxiety as much that you can't really go on with your usual life, and then you should really seek help. And I did, and it really helped me. And I was kind of puzzled about this, because at first I was like, okay, but like going to psychotherapy wouldn't help me like solve the climate crisis. So how should this help me like get along with it? But it really helped, and I can just recommend doing this if you're really like troubled that much in your private life.
Okay, thanks for sharing that, Sarah. And yeah, you've been in the deep end being impacted. Ajit, we spoke about this before when we had the pre-meeting. You are not in that place, and you're wondering whether you're not in that place yet, or how would you put it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's any other, well, emotionally repressed British men in the audience, but I think it's quite a common thing to feel among climate journalists, to either feel way too overwhelmed by everything, or from what a couple of people have also said to me, this feeling of like, should I be more worried? Should I be more stressed? And certainly I think, I actually have thumbs up for the, presumably for the, yeah. I definitely have had a couple of moments over the last 3 years where I've read something that has kind of just floored me, and I've been like, wow, shit, there's no coming back from that. I mean, for me, it was reading these IPCC reports was really that like turning point for me, I guess. And one thing that I found was that it was all still fairly manageable. I mean, you hear, I don't know, say the IPCC says that 1 in 100-year coastal floods will be hitting most of the world's coast every single year, regardless of really what we do. That's the minimum we're kind of expecting it to get just because of sea level rise. Then you might process that, you might talk about it with friends, you might talk about it with scientists, and you have some level of kind of awareness of, okay, what does that mean for me? What does it mean for other people? Does that feeling of, okay, whose lives is this really destroying? But then for me, what's always been way worse than any of that stuff has been turning on the TV the next day. And I think that's what I was chatting to Juliana and Sada and Patrick about in the pre-meeting, that basically the depressing part of climate change for me is climate coverage. And it's the politicians who go on TV the next day and will be talking about the new liquefied natural gas terminals they're building on the north coast of Germany, where I'm based, or I don't know, whatever. We all have examples from our own countries, right? And so I think that's one thing that's kind of been on my mind a lot, particularly, and maybe we'll get to this more later on, but we're all overworked. We're doing a job which has a big sense of purpose because the situation's so bad and the quality of journalism is also so bad that anything we're doing is having a massive impact. And at the same time, we're doing it partly because we feel passionate about it, because we feel very strongly about it, because it's obviously a really important issue and affects all of us. And that kind of leaves you in a situation where you're quite vulnerable to, feeling very low about it, suffering from burnout. And I think that, to me, sorry, just to come back to the start of the question, for me, I've got this feeling of like, is it just inevitable? Is it kind of looming on the horizon? And I think after seeing a few of the climate journalists who write newsletter, who I follow, take pauses because of burnout, talking to friends who've been through the same thing, who also cover climate. I mean, I don't want to say it's inevitable. We don't know that, obviously. I can imagine that it's got all the ingredients for making it much more likely.
Thanks. And Megan, I get you to talk us through the various reactions, and can you help us get a language for all of this, because there's so many different reactions involved: grief, anger, we've talked about anxiety, some people talk about trauma, and the language is quite free. And I think if we want to have a decent conversation about it, we really have to nail down the concepts. And we do have a slide for this, if we can for a little while, and then also see Megan's speak, that would be great. Over to you in terms of what are we actually talking about and how are we naming it?
Okay, great. So climate anxiety, Harvard's just done a really good definition of it that's been sort of looked at again over the past few years, and it's climate anxiety or eco anxiety. It's distress related to worries about the effects of climate change. And we always want to talk about what climate change or what climate anxiety isn't. And it's certainly not a diagnosable mental health disorder. And I can say that all of the people that I've worked with are on board with that, not that being the case, that it should not be a mental health disorder because it's an appropriate response to the biggest existential crisis we've ever faced. And the alternative sort of idea about that is that actually, if it were recognized as sort of a diagnosable disorder, then it could potentially receive more funding and more research. However, we're really in the camp that this is a normal response to to the climate crisis, and this is how people. It's normal that people are feeling this way. It's an anxiety rooted in uncertainty about the future, and it's alerting us to the dangers of climate change. Again, we're getting all these signals in our body and our emotions because we are under threat, and this is a normal human response. Climate change is a real threat, and therefore it's normal to experience worries about fear and consequences. Anxiety about climate is often accompanied by feelings of grief, anger, and shame, which can affect mood, behavior, and thinking. So this is sort of a rendition of what Glenn Albrecht originally did, written by Isaiah Hernandez, who goes under at Queer Brand Vegan, and he talks. Can you guys see that? Okay, it's a little bit faded, but anyway, it's basically identifying that you know, how we sort of name these emotions when we talk about this umbrella that's become climate anxiety. So the Overton window is something that basically is what the general public finds acceptable to discuss. It brings it into the popular discourse. And around 2019, excuse me, I'm a little climate change, climate anxiety really entered the public lexicon. We started hearing about climate anxiety in television shows, in music, noticing it sort of changes around it in even menus and things like that. So people started to really latch on to the word climate anxiety. And I think that was really important because suddenly we had a name for something, and it helps people connect. And when we talk about mental health and sort of how it's changed in recent years, a lot of young people are really driving the conversations about naming their feelings, acknowledging that they feel anxious or depressed. And so this gave people that were feeling worried or angry or grieving about climate anxiety or about the climate crisis sort of a natural sort of hub to connect with. And saying this, I think it is important to really acknowledge that it's important that we have this word, but also to sort of kind of anchor into the fact that we need to start talking about the emotions that are beyond climate anxiety, because part of the narrative that journalists have the sort of benefit of communicating is connecting with people on different levels. And so when we talk about climate grief, for example, that might be something that suddenly engages someone who doesn't necessarily feel that anxiety. Or solastalgia, when people recognize that they feel very sad because a place that they've grown up with is starting to change. For example, the Inuit, the ice is very much part of their culture and their identity and their livelihoods. And so watching that disappear is hugely traumatic because it's something that they love. There's also things like solophilia, which is a love and appreciation of a place that we can feel this connection with. So when we acknowledge the range of emotions that go under this umbrella, it allows us to connect more with how we feel, but also how people who we're either interviewing on the front line or scientists that we're talking to, how we connect with them and start to build stories, because what we've been missing is the stories. And I think that's why it's important to think about what language we use and how we're naming and normalizing these feelings.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because that is also in terms of the work that the Dart Center does. We regard actually talking about trauma or exposure to traumatic stress, because everybody needs to suffer trauma, but we regard this as a craft issue, because you have to understand what anxiety, what trauma, what exposure to traumatic stress does to you and what it does to a contributor in order to do journalism properly. You need to know how to work with somebody who's an interviewee, who's gone through traumatic events, so that you can do better journalism. Also, it's really important knowing where you are as a journalist and what exposure to all of these issues does to you, in order that you can look after your well-being. And of course, it's really important, and maybe we can get to that in question after next, in newsrooms, what editors actually need to know when they're managing people who are exposed to dealing with these stories. But I wanted to go back to one expression, Megan, that you used, because I know now from having covered some of the psychology that this comes up quite a lot, and it's not necessarily intuitive to journalists. You mentioned shame. Why would journalists experience feelings of shame when they cover climate stories and feel the effect of that on them?
I think I was thinking about this, and actually journalists are almost the frontline psychologists, because you're the first to have these conversations with people that have been directly impacted by climate change. And you have to hold this emotional space while trying to tease out information in an empathetic and compassionate way that's going to let them tell their story to the world. So it's such a vulnerable place for both you and, I mean, effectively your client or your interviewee to be in, because you're having to connect with them and still trying to, you know, get the information that you need, but then you have to just walk away. And for people that are like, for psychologists, for example, we have much more containment in how we process, how we close, how we work through a relationship. Whereas there's this feeling of just sort of back into the void, I think, for journalists. And I think this is something that's really important to name and identify and start to build systems of support around. And that, I think, really comes from connecting with other journalists that have these experiences.
Yeah, and as we know from other emotionally challenging issues, is the feeling of guilt also around that we're dealing with people who are often so much worse off. I mean, we're interviewing somebody whose house may have just been washed away, and yet then, you know, we sit at home being emotionally affected, and I know from myself and from other journalists that then the issues of guilt are often around what right do I have to feel bad about all of this, when it's actually people living through much worse. And there is actually a validation of those feelings is a powerful thing, isn't it?
I think so. And I think, I mean, I like to look at the difficult climate emotions as just absolute beacons for our values. So they're almost like shining a light. So look at your difficult emotions, whether it's anger or guilt or grief, anything that feels hard to manage, feels uncomfortable, makes you feel like you want to push it away or get rid of it. Actually, look at it with curiosity. You know, if you feel angry, look at how perhaps that reflects your sense of social justice. Or if you feel scared, you know, perhaps that shows, you know, you care about the future of a species or your children or your grandparents. You know, what is it that's actually, what value is that showing? And so for guilt, I think it shows empathy. It shows that that's high on your values, that you can compassionately think about others. And so rather than pushing that guilt away, thanking that guilt and saying, actually, this shows that I'm a person that cares, and thanking yourself for being that person and allowing for that just to be. Because again, when we feel that guilt, a lot of that comes from you know, from the individual, whereas actually that's where we need to push back and look at the bigger systems and the wider systems who need to feel more guilty, and we need to feel less guilty.
Yeah, and we'll get back to the importance of community as well, but thank you for that. I think this is so important, and I can see from the messages popping up in the box that people really really react to this being said. So thank you. And we have time for questions afterwards, and the questions will actually not be recorded, so we can come back to any of that later on. I just want to, I've got two more points that I want to discuss before we get to the question. So the first one is really is about newsroom culture, and you've already brought up that your worry is, and you're not particularly old yourself, I should say, that younger colleagues are affected particularly hard, and that there is a newsroom culture that can make it quite difficult for people coming into this topic. Do you want to say a bit more about it, what you've observed?
Yeah, I just add to that. I mean, one of the kind of things that I think a lot of Well, a few of the climate journalists I've chatted to have said is this idea that they're looking around them within their environment desk and they're not necessarily seeing their environment editor or their kind of more experienced colleagues necessarily dealing with the same stuff, or at the very least not discussing it if they are. And I think, I mean, we chatted about this a bit with Patrick and Zara as well. Like, there's a couple of things that could be going on here, but one of them might just be that, okay, maybe the language to talk about mental health is just more developed among kind of younger generations. Another aspect could be this feeling of kind of having to prove yourself in a tough profession. I think so Patrick gave the comparison of junior doctors basically having burnout under very similar circumstances, right? They're driving themselves super hard and trying to prove themselves at every step of the process. And then this whole factor that I mentioned earlier of like thinking you're doing something for the greater good kind of leaves you very vulnerable to say it explicitly, to being exploited. And I think that's something that maybe, we don't talk about enough and could chat about more. And I think, Zara, you also raised the point as well that there could be a level of the more experienced editors having covered this for so long at a point when things were still a bit less certain, right?
Yeah, and then not being as emotionally attached to it than like when you're younger and coming into it at a stage where the crisis is already that acute that you can't really unsee it. As you said, there's some kind of point where you just can't go back when you just realized how bad the crisis is. And that was also something that I wanted to add, like, to the two of you, that yes, as journalists, we kind of have the opportunity to connect to a lot of people and also talk about it, and this kind of helps. But in the newsroom, you can feel quite isolated because you're often like the only climate expert or the only one covering it, or maybe not just the only one, but the only one who seems to have some kind of emotions about it. And this is really, really a hard feeling. And this is also one reason why we in Germany, we founded the climate journalism network, because we had some kind of smaller circle of journalists getting together and kind of sharing emotions, but also like talking about things we couldn't talk about in our newsrooms because other people didn't really know what we're talking about. And so we wanted to bring people together and give them the opportunity to exchange and feel connected. And it was really like, that was the first thing we really kind of achieved, that everybody was like, oh, I'm not the only one. Wow, this is mind-blowing. And this feels so good. And another thing you were talking about is shame. And I do encounter shame on another level, because now I'm giving these workshops for journalists, as I said. And this is sometimes really challenging for people, because I do have people who are journalists for, I don't know, maybe 20 years, and they are explaining the world to others. And then they just realize, oh, we didn't really understand the world in the first place, right? And this really puts a lot of shame and guilt on us, because like, okay, was I part of the problem? How could I not understand? And even I did have the feeling for just like being a journalist for 10 years and like in smaller positions. And that's really important, that I'm always talking about, okay, this is not about personal faults or shortcomings or something. There are structural reasons, and there are a lot of reasons in a psychology sphere and on lobbyism and stuff like this, that we don't really see this, and we don't learn it in school or stuff like this enough. So there are reasons for this, and that's why I'm always explaining this, to kind of take this shame and guilt from journalists, to make it easier to really connect to the information I just gave them. Because if I don't do though, like shame is just like, okay, she's telling just like really, really bad stuff, and I'm just gonna forget it and not really get into it. And like taking off the shame really helps to connect to this information.
Thank you so much. And that's actually exactly where we do want to go next, because generally, I think often with mental health as a whole, and particularly in this, we have to be very careful to put everything onto the individual and to say, oh, you know, your job is very hard, and why don't you meditate a little bit more? And of course, self-care is important, and we all need to know how to have boundaries with work and so on. But to put it all onto the individual is potentially really problematic. Megan, do you want to say a bit more about this?
Sure. Yeah. So we did some research last year, and one of the results was that people climate information seeking people often report higher levels of climate anxiety. And so if this is part of your job and you have to constantly be seeking further information, it's likely that the more you know, statistically, the more anxious you'll be about it. And one of the things that people, and what we used to say is climate anxiety to climate action. You know, actually, if you engage, or if you have climate anxiety and you engage in some climate action, it reduces your levels of this. But what we ended up having to put in as a caveat is climate anxiety to sustainable climate action, because it has to be sustainable for your mental health and for the planet. Because what we notice is that actually this climate action became sort of a buffer for people to where they were trying to suppress their anxiety by doing more action and more action and more action until they just burnt out. And actually, that's something that's so common. And what we see now, again, we have a new caveat as we learn more and more about this, is that what it is it shouldn't be individual action, it should be collective action. And it needs to be collective action for a couple of reasons, because collective action helps us to normalize our emotions. It helps to reinforce the behavioral changes that we want to do. It helps to reinforce the actions that they'll actually be achieved. But also, collectively, we have more pushback on the systems that need to be changed. And so if I go to a politician as an individual and say what I want changed, it's not going to be heard as much as if I go with my collective group who empathizes with my feelings, who understands what needs to be achieved. We're sort of the louder voice. And I always think of sort of the strike of the Friday strikes with Greta Thunberg. It's like one small person, like one single person managed to affect so much change by integrating a connection with a communities and have collectively made the systems pay attention to what they want and what they want changed. And I think by doing that in each profession, you know, whether it's lawyers who have bound together for climate action, whether it's journalists, you know, all of these groups are coming together, and they're much more resilient in what they want to change and in themselves, because they've joined as a group rather than as an individual.
I see lots of nodding on screen. I also want to ask Sarah, Ajit, if one of you may want to say a little bit more, because we also know that historically that there's been a lot of industry lobbying, and we know this from investigative journalism, that has put the solutions to the climate crisis on the individual, whether it's recycling or so I don't know if one of you want to draw a couple of quick parallels, because what Megan is saying in terms of solution on a psychological level is not unique.
That's what I just meant about, like, there are so many reasons why we don't really want to see it. And it's also, I would say, talking really clearly about the climate crisis, and I'm talking very directly and openly about emotions, and I'm doing this for the reason to also kind of irritate people and just like confront them but also try to build bridges. And like explaining this is really important to make it possible for people to really kind of get into it. And we really do have a big problem that all these lobby narratives are still like transported in the political and media sphere, like they're just some kind of arguments. It's like most journalists are not really aware about all these tactics and all the arguments, and they just like reported like one possible opinion on stuff, and they don't have the necessary the information and all the knowledge about like really giving context about this, being really sure about how to present this and how to like also explain why it's not true and stuff like this. And this is kind of sad, because there are journalists who know all this and can explain it, but it's not really knowledge that was transferred into the broader political reporting sphere.
So I'm going to connect that question, or carry on with that question, because I do think, you know, that there's a circle that connects to to well-being as well. If the lobbying and it does of course reach into the newsroom, as you said, and the way the climate story is written, which has been heavily influenced, if that reaches into the newsroom, I'm not sure every journalist is able to analyze that and to be across it. Whose responsibility is it to make sure that there is this awareness of where the information comes from and how the information flow has been shaped? Is it editors? Is it fellow journalists? I mean, what can we do to be a clearer understanding about how the coverage unfolds? And then
maybe my short answer from like the structural point of view, I'm always saying we're having structural problems, so we have to solve it on this level. So I would say that editors-in-chief are responsible for giving the time and opportunity to people to really like get into it and learn about it and stuff like this. But we're having a problem here because these editors-in-chiefs might not be aware of this and not see where they are lacking and missing at this time. So every journalist should be going to their editors-in-chiefs and just demanding the opportunity to go on a workshop, to, I don't know, have time to build a team, to build up some expertise in the newsroom and stuff like this. So I would say everybody has to do its share.
Yeah, is there, Ajit or Megan, is there anything you want to add?
I would just like to add that actually a lot of social change that we've seen through whether it's civil rights or women's right to vote, you don't need the whole population to get on board. You need about 25%. And I would say that actually that works in big organizations, it works in countries, but it can also probably work in the newsroom. You don't need everybody on board, but you need a key number of people. And actually, what we've seen across organizations is it's not necessarily the people at the top, but it's the people at the bottom. And you start, or it can be, the people that are just coming into it. And especially as I think we see the workforce that's coming up into up into the field, there a green and social and ecological identity is really important to them. And people that are hitting the workforce are gravitating towards companies and organizations that care about sustainability and care about things like this. So actually, it's not that you need to get everybody on board. You need that certain number on board, and then you can start to influence the greater groups.
Yeah, if I can just add two things to that. One is that I think within a lot of big kind of public broadcasters, big media organizations, legacy media organizations, one of the key things would be to get the editors-in-chief to actually understand the science, and ideally for any of them to read an IPCC report. I really hope that at least one of them has. And the other thing would then be the middle management, because often they're the ones who have more control over direct editorial decisions. So if you've got the business editor and the head of the, I don't know, the political correspondent, say, people in positions of power who are not just your regular journalists, reporters across the board, but who do carry some weight and either directly have access to the politicians or who have some commanding voices within their own organizations, would also be a very good avenue to kind of tackle that.
Thanks. So before I get to the last question, and the last question, obviously some thinking time here, is as we've discussed before, it is and any tips that we haven't given yet, but any tips for resilience in this whole from all of three of you will be great before we get to the Q&A. But before we get there, I want to highlight two other concepts with Megan and ask her about it, which is transformative resilience and post-traumatic growth, because these are concepts from psychology that we see in other areas as well, about that you can work through something really difficult and potentially traumatic and come out on the other side and grow. And journalists, research shows that journalists are particularly resilient because we are good in meaning making. Our stories aid the process of meaning making, and that's really a very important part of coming out on the other side. Megan, do you want to say a bit more about that?
Certainly, yeah. Sorry, one second. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's firstly probably important to differentiate between PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which can occur after a traumatic event, but it's not to say that that always occurs after a traumatic event. Whereas trauma is the ubiquitous sort of human response to things that, you know, the hard things that happen in our life, the hardships that we come up against. And as journalists, you are more likely to come up against these things. And I think that it's important to, like climate anxiety, there also are some people that are more prone to experiencing and, you know, sort of taking in trauma in a way that might result in PTSD, in the same way that people that are more anxiety prone might experience deeper levels of climate anxiety if they have more general anxiety. So that's not to say that, you know, you know, makes you lack empathy if you don't deeply feel this trauma. Some people experience more and some people experience less. I think likewise, how we were talking about how Sarah and Ajit, you know, he experiences less, sort of less eco-anxiety, whereas our experiences a bit more. It's quite similar, you know, for me, I experience it more generally, whereas my partner, you know, is quite resilient in that sense. And I think that it allows us to sort of step back and think about where we are on sort of on those levels. Am I more susceptible to feeling these deep emotions, or actually do I feel like I'm more resilient in this? And if so, if you do feel like you have that sort of resilience and it doesn't affect you so much, just allowing for that, but also allowing for the debrief after. So if you are starting to feel those emotions, talking about them. If you are somebody who is, you know, more sensitive and deeply feeling, having sort of a toolkit of what you do to debrief, whether it's taking a break, whether it's talking to someone, whether it's a professional or a colleague, or having someone sort of in your arsenal of who you can go to. And again, I think it's just allowing for those emotions to remind you that it's based on a value of your commitment to sharing your experiences, sharing the experiences of others, telling the stories. And I love how you talked about sort of journalists having that resilience, because there's that processing, there's making sense of why you're there. And I think that is such a beautiful aspect of the climate narrative. It's like we all need to anchor into our story of why this matters to us, why we're going to keep showing up, why we are going to be resilient, why we're not going to give up. And I think that really cultivating that and looking deeper into that as journalists will build that resilience in a really positive way.
Thanks. That's really great. So thank you that. And it's so we'll get to the tips, and I think we've gone through so much already. And I've asked my colleague Minal to send me some WhatsApp of what's in the chat, so that I haven't I don't spend too much time reading the chat, but there's already the question of guidelines. And I think what we want to do after this webinar is run through what's been discussed and see if we can work on some guidelines and some tips. So that's definitely something that we're thinking about. And if you sign up on the Google Doc, we can send you whatever we come up with. So to my knowledge, that there are no specialized guidelines out there at the moment that can be shared, but that is something that we like to work on, and maybe like to work on more as a team here in the panel. So in the absence of this, we've talked about a lot, and maybe we don't repeat everything, but what are your tips? What have the panelists got to say? And then we go into the discussion in a minute. Ajit, is there anything that you would put on the table for people to take away?
Two quick thoughts spring to mind. The first being, if there's any particular claim that really is stressing you out, like I don't mean the general mass of, oh shit, the world's on fire, but more like within an individual area, you've heard something, then really just check it out. I mean, sometimes these claims are overblown. Like, I don't want to say that's the rule or that it's regular, but some of the biggest claims I think that seem to have sparked some level of deep emotional distress, and I've heard this from a few climate scientists who said that they get students emailing them in on a spectrum of dark feelings ranging to suicide. And they've kind of struggled with the fact that some of these students are reporting part of their feeling being grounded in things that aren't what climate scientists are saying or what the climate science literature shows. And so that would be my first thing, that if there's anything specific, really do check it out. And I mean, of course, you may find that, oh, shit, it's true in this case, which is then something where I guess the next step would then be to talk to people about it and all of the kind of regular stuff that you've already heard of. One thing that I can maybe add that I did find personally kind of comforting, and I would be curious if anyone else shares this feeling. We talked a bit about the whole kind of systemic versus individual responsibility. And I think I went through a little journey of kind of being first like, okay, cool, like the way we solve climate change is that we stop doing these things that we individually do that are polluting. And then over 2019 and 2020, we had a big push in terms of kind of the narrative did shift among climate scientists, journalists, and we talked a lot more about systemic changes, and that's great. One thing that I think maybe has gotten a little lost is that we do still have ridiculous amounts of agency. If you're a middle-class person in a rich country working in a professional job, and I don't know, you live in a democracy. I mean, I think there's a good nature study about this that I can post in the chat, but one scientist I spoke to just said it like this, like, you can vote, like loads of people in the world cannot even vote to get their systemic change. And I think when you narrow it down to all the possible things you could be doing, and I mean, well beyond just, okay, do I buy this, I don't know, veggie burger or the beef burger? There's loads of stuff that you as an individual can do that collectively have way more impact. Still need to start with individuals to some degree, some of which can be helped by policy, but not all, and some of which will help push policy. And so I guess it is all connected, and you as individuals, depending on where you live and what your circumstances are, you have a huge amount of power. And I would say just don't fall into the trap that some of the narrative is pushing into, which is this idea that, oh, why should I worry about my flights abroad if Kylie Jenner flies in a private jet? And I mean, the way you can look at it is that if we're like some of the most privileged people in the world, looking at the people even more privileged than us doesn't help that much if there's people below us who could also say the same to us. Anyway, point being that we do have power, and I think we don't recognize how much we really have.
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump in here. And I really loved everything that you just said. Besides, I wouldn't say that voting is such a good strategy to really do enough, because like next time we are able to vote in Germany, we will have used up the CO2 budget already. So we should get, and we can get active in a lot of ways. And actually getting active in a sense of, in your professional field or in your neighborhood or wherever you do have some kind of systemic leverage, you can just like get active and try to change something that is bigger than your own household. And it's even in the IPCC report, in the third part, that they really look at how can we accelerate the change that we already see. There is a lot of things going on, and it's really, really, really possible that it gets faster and that we get a lot done, but somebody has to do it. And so everybody of us gets into the field here. And I can really recommend getting active, even though I have to admit that Megan is right about like getting active is not like being the cure. It also confronts you with a lot of stuff, but it also makes you feel like Ajit said in the beginning, I think like kind of there is some kind of sense, and it makes you kind of, I don't know, feel better. It helped for me. And what was also mentioned here already in the talk is that you really should connect to people who do understand you, and where you can kind of talk about your emotions, and where you can validate stuff. And either you can find colleagues in your newsroom who do understand you, or you can find others in some kind of organization. There are also like international networks about stuff like this. Or if you can't find someone in your field you're working in, you might like connect to other climate groups who exchange about your emotions. And this really helps a lot, not feeling like the freak and the only one and stuff like this. And then what also was mentioned already was like, take care of yourself. So I wasn't that good in it for the last 2.5 years. And I can see a lot of people getting into climate who have the same problems. And we kind of joked about meditating, but actually for me it helps. I could just like, recommend it on top. And Ajit was also right about like really getting informed about stuff, because as I said, I'm communicating about the climate crisis in a very direct way. And I often get to hear that, no, you can't do this, you can't confront people so hard, and this is way too, I don't know, overwhelming and stuff like this. But that's not what I get as feedback. Like, people are actually kind of thankful when I just explain them where we stand, and then they're able to see where we are and what we're still able to do and what we're not, like, or what's not working and stuff like this. And so we are still in a position that we can turn things around, at least to a level where we can adopt and where we can still have some kind of good life for like many of us being in this world. And so yeah, this helped for me, and it might help for you.
Can I just jump in quickly?
Sure.
I just quickly wanted to say just 3 things, because I think you guys are in such an amazing position to be able to change the world. So I guess the first thing would be, actually, I know that we did say, you know, like, again, touching on the meditation part, but actually self-care is crucial in this space. And the activists that we work with, the first thing they will tell you is that they have a really good self-care plan. And it's for the individual. For one girl, she said, I actually schedule in looking at my fish, because I was trying to meditate and I just kept falling asleep, but I needed to so I just look at my fish for 10 minutes a day. And it sounds really odd, but it works for her. For some people, it's going for a walk, it's connecting with nature, it's cooking a meal with somebody, but it's whatever it is, find your self-care go-tos, especially, and keep them going throughout your week. Acknowledge the work that you're doing, because it's so easy to sort of lose sight of all of the amazing actions that you're taking. And if we don't benchmark and celebrate our successes, we don't see the value that we're bringing. And then it doesn't help us to feel that self-efficacy to keep going. And then I just quickly wanted to talk about sort of how individual action is still essential. We all need to be taking individual action. Mark Maslin is a professor at UCL, and he wrote a wonderful book called The Facts, where he very distinctly puts out what individuals need to do, what governments need to do, and what corporations need to do. And he's on Instagram as Professor Mark Maslin, or read the book, it's amazing, but it's very simple, the most effective things that people can do. And for just to start off, as individuals, looking at what you can do. For example, it's talk about climate change, switch to plant-based diets, reduce, reuse, recycle, divest from fossil fuels. So he has all these examples. What we talk about is impact, ease, and meaning in a Venn diagram. So you think about, you know, what's easy for me? What am I already good at? Well, a lot of you are journalists, so you're good communicators, or perhaps you're good at finance, or perhaps you like to run, you know, whatever it is, and you want to base your climate actions around those. So I always use the example of my kids who pick up plastic waste when we go to the beach, and it really bugs them, and they care about it, and it's important for them. Then they decided, actually, you know, so that's the meaning. We care about the planet. We want to take care of the ocean. Well, how can we have the biggest impact? Well, we could raise money for it rather than going and picking up the bits here and there. Well, what's easy for us? Well, we like running, so we're going to do a 5K, and then we get our friends to do it, and then we get donations, and we spread the word. So rather than them just going from picking up plastic, look at how you can have a bigger impact in the things that you do. And again, talking about it is so important, but framing in each of your, in everything that you put out there, talk about the solutions, because people want to hear about the solutions, what they need to do to change, what needs to happen to change. So looking at what the corporations need to do, the governments need to do. When we provide people with negative information, we want to provide them with 3 positive solutions and stories to motivate them and engage them and keep them going.
This is so brilliant, because you also just gave me the throw to the next session that we are doing Friday in a week, where we have 3 more panelists in the second part of this workshop series, talking about stories, the role of solutions in stories, and yeah. So I'll leave it at that, because we've got about 15 minutes left, which is what we can dedicate to questions, and again, post for us. Maybe not, I think I may do the questions just by raising hands in a minute, But you can continue to post in the chat for us, because we will be looking at this after this webinar and the next, because we will want to work on it. So any input is really helpful and useful for us. And we've agreed that we will stop the recording for the questions, so that people